Hello folks, my name is Sandra and welcome to a video about art and the gaze and history and how it all mingles together. I love yapping, and one of my favorite artistic movements is the aesthetics movement. I also fully believe that women's history and queer history needs to be talked about a little bit more, so that will be the main focus of the video. The aesthetics movement was a really big movement in England. So that will be the area that I'm talking about the most, specifically because the writers that I'm talking about lived in England. I also want to acknowledge that Britain and the UK is not the only place that so many amazing artistic movements began and developed. I also don't want to say that queer people only existed in the UK, because that is demonstrably not true. A lot of this video will also be talking about specifically the Victorian era, just because that's when the aesthetics movement really took off. Aestheticism as an arts movement was also mainly an arts movement that was able to be pursued by people of a certain class. It was definitely not a movement that lower class working individuals would have had time to enjoy. While women writers were at a very big disadvantage in the Victorian era and for a long time before and after that, the women that I'm talking about did come from relatively wealthy families, so they had a lot more resources at their disposal. But before we get into the meat and potatoes, as it were, I think it would be a little bit helpful for us to talk just a little bit about the definition of aestheticism as a movement, as well as the word lesbianism, because to be totally honest, it hasn't always been the same. Aestheticism's foundations were sort of first laid out in the 1700s by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant also studied epistemology and ethics. Kant came up with the idea that aesthetic standards should be autonomous from the society's morality and ethics, utility, even the society's idea of pleasure. Of course, other thinkers helped popularize this philosophy in England and France. Really, the core of aestheticism is that beauty should exist for the sake of it being beautiful, and art exists for the sake of being art. The Oxford English Dictionary also has a very helpful definition that I will be reading off of now because I think it's very helpful. It is as follows. Aestheticism is the pursuit of or devotion to what is beautiful or attractive to the senses, especially as opposed to an ethically or rationally based outlook. One of the sources that I used when researching all of this stuff is called Anxious Performances, Aestheticism, the Art Gallery, and the Ambulatory Geographies of Late 19th Century London, which is by Andrew Stevenson. He gives us even more information on aestheticism. He says that it is the challenging of the natural and conventional, and it also gave more freedom to non-heteronormative relationships and artists. The aesthetics movement recontextualized male and female bodies, gay and straight, in terms that had previously been considered perverse within the public imaginary. So we have a basic understanding of aestheticism. Now let's look more into LGBT rights in England. The first civil sodomy law that was passed was in 1533, and it was pioneered by King Henry VIII, and it was called the Buggery Act. That act was repealed in 1553 by Queen Mary I, but it was then reinstated in 1563 under Queen Elizabeth I. The punishment for the Buggery Act was execution. The last people to be executed for sodomy in England were James Pratt and John Smith, and that was in 1835. Sorry, I'm looking over to the side because I've got all my numbers there. The death penalty for sodomy was removed in 1861. However, you could still be charged for homosexual acts. Those were punishable by imprisonment. It wasn't until 1967 that the decriminalization of sexual acts between men came to be. All of those laws had to do with men. And you might be thinking, that seems unfair. I'm here to say, kind of, but not for the way that you think it is. It was because of misogyny. Relationships between women weren't seen as something that could be sexual, and they weren't understood by greater society at that time. And now this is a segue into talking about the definition of lesbianism that I will be using in this video. The word lesbianism has only existed since the 1870s, but there were a few different terms before then to essentially mean the same thing. An example of something like that would be the word sapphism, although there were a lot of scholars that tried to change the translations of Sappho's poetry to be about a man and be heterosexual, but around the late Victorian era, people were aware that she was not, in fact, writing poetry about men. The Oxford English Dictionary's definition of lesbianism has remained consistent since the 1870s, and there it is defined as sexual or romantic attraction between women, sexual activity between women, also lesbian nature or identity. So I wasn't able to get my grubby little hands on an article that I wanted to get my grubby little hands onto, written by Martha Vicinus, titled Intimate Friends, but I did read a review of it, so I could pull some quotes. In this review of it, written by Valerie Koronek, Valerie Koronek gives us another definition that we can use for lesbianism. I'm going to do a cheeky little read of this quote because I think it's a really good definition. Koronek defines lesbians as women who manage to prioritize love for each other as the central organizing principle of their lives. So that offers us a little bit of a wider understanding of what a lesbian can be, or a historical lesbian can be. I also read an entry written by Gabriel Griffins in a Dictionary of Gender Studies, and they included romantic friendships under their definition of lesbianism. If you grew up queer in high school, we've all had those friendships. We all understand what it is. Now that we've defined what lesbianism is, let's go through a little bit of a timeline of women's rights in England. During the late Victorian era in England, gender roles weren't only strictly enforced by society, but they were also pretty restricted by the law. Women were expected to stay within the private sphere, and men were expected to exist in the public sphere. Now, the public sphere could include things like politics and running businesses and writing and reading and all of these things. Basically, all of the things that women fought for the right to do. So the private sphere was, staying at home, taking care of the family, those kinds of things. There was this sort of idea called the angel of the house, where a woman was a positive influence on her husband. She was the one responsible for making sure that he was respectful, that he was doing the things that he needed to do. And it was at the price of her own suffering. Virginia Woolf actually had a lot of opinions on the angel of the house, and was very vocal about the fact that she believed women should kill the angel of the house. The angel of the house, this is a big tangent, but the angel of the house is sort of, the woman will sit in the drafty spot so that she can block the wind from her husband. Or she'll make sure that everyone else gets to eat first, and then she'll take whatever is left. That kind of thing, and we can still see the impact of that stereotype in our modern world. There was this idea that the wife could influence her husband to do something, and influence her husband to vote a certain way, but she couldn't outright say it, because that would be stepping too far into the public sphere. Until 1870, as soon as a woman married, all of her property and money and all of those things got transferred over to her husband. In 1870, the Married Women's Property Act was passed, and that entitled women to be able to keep their land, keep their money in a marriage and in a divorce. Or if they were widowed, that also. Women were also at a truly massive academic disadvantage for hundreds of years. Sure, wealthy women could sometimes afford the privilege of getting a private education within the home. We have many examples of women writers whose works have survived long enough that were in that situation. Someone that pops into my mind immediately is Dorothy Wordsworth. You might recognize the last name Wordsworth from William Wordsworth, who was her older brother. Dorothy actually kept a very, very detailed diary of her life and her interactions with other people. She wrote poems herself, and her brother, who was very, very well known in the Romantic movement, would take her work and would sometimes tweak things and would sometimes not tweak things and publish it under his own name. It's not totally fair, but she heavily, heavily influenced the Romantic literary genre. In 1868, women became allowed to attend universities. However, they were not allowed to gain a degree. They could attend the classes, they were constantly outperforming their male colleagues on exams, but they weren't eligible for their degree. That changed in 1880, which is very recent. Women only became allowed to leave their violent husbands in 1878. Some women became eligible to vote in county and borough elections in 1888. Not all women, and not in every election. By 1907, women were able to be elected onto councils, and the next year, in 1908, the first woman in all of Britain was elected to be a mayor. Finally, 1918, a year that is a really big deal in voting rights, was when women over the age of 30 who met certain property requirements were eligible to vote. Again, not all women. Now that we have a little bit of historical background in terms of the art movement that we're talking about, which is aestheticism, and women and queer rights in England and the UK in general, let's get into talking about the 2 or 3, depending on how you're counting them, women writers that I'm excited to be talking about. Michael Field and Amy Levy. Michael Field was the joint pseudonym between Catherine Harris Bradley and Edith Emma Cooper. In their time, again, the late Victorian period, women writing was really looked down upon. Not a respectable field to go into at all. Women writers would frequently take on pseudonyms to get around these social expectations. For example, Charlotte Bronte published under the name Currer Bell, and her sister, Emily Bronte, published under the name Ellis Bell. Pseudonyms would also protect women writers from the ruthless criticism that they would get for publishing as women. Long story short, if they pretended to be men, their works would reach a wider audience and they would be more acceptable. There was also an additional layer of protection for Bradley and Cooper writing under Michael Field, and that was that they, under a male pseudonym, were able to get away with writing more masculine styles of poetry, like sonnets. In these sonnets, in their poems, they would also write pretty freely about their love of other women, and also each other. Now, this is the part where us as a modern audience might have a little bit of a more difficult time getting on board with Michael Field's relationship today. And that was because Bradley and Cooper were aunt and niece. The two of them started living together after Cooper's mother became quite ill, and taking on that more maternal role for Cooper eventually led Bradley to gain feelings, same with Cooper, and it turned into a relationship. Again, not really something you'd see today, but the Victorians and their family dynamics were pretty wild. The more I learn about it, the more I'm like, oh. Cooper and Bradley lived together, they worked together, they wrote their poetry together. They even kept a journal together about their daily lives. When I say they wrote poetry together, I'm not talking about one of them would write something and then they'd talk about it and then that person would continue writing. I'm talking about they would literally write part of a poem, pass the pen to the other one, and then they would finish the poem. That's awesome. That's really, really cool. And they were able to it was so seamless. They just make it so seamless. Bradley and Cooper were insistent that Michael Field existed as a separate entity from them. That Michael Field was the individual that the two of them would become through their writing. On April 23rd, 1892, the two of them had a pseudo-marriage where they proclaimed their everlasting love for each other. They also vowed to be poets and lovers forevermore. You can't get away with just saying these were gals being pals here. After their pseudo-marriage, they considered themselves more closely married than Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. These were other very, very prolific writers and poets at the time. They were also very closely friends with Robert Browning for a while, which did eventually lead to them being found out as Michael Field. When they told Robert Browning that they were Michael Field, they made it very clear that they didn't want it to be known, and it turns out, if someone writes a lot, they can't be trusted to keep their mouths shut. The two were heavily influenced by Sappho of Lesbos, and of course her poetry, not just her as a person. Their first collection of poems, titled Long Ago, first published in 1889, was celebrating Sappho. The way that they celebrated Sappho was taking the existing fragments of her poetry and using them as jumping off points for their own poetry. Long ago touched not only on female desire, but asserted that the study of classics was accessible to women as a way for them to express their desire. In their time, Bradley and Cooper were hedonists and pagans, although later I do believe that they converted over to Roman Catholicism, likely because they wanted comfort that they were going to live together forever in the afterlife. Even though their relationship is maybe not at all the best representation of lesbians in literature that we have nowadays, it is undeniable that their work helped pave the way for future writers. Together, they published more than 40 literary works, which is about 40 more than I've ever published. We're gonna take a moment and actually read some of the poetry that they wrote, and the two poems of theirs that I will be talking about today are titled A Girl and To Christina Rossetti. So here is A Girl. A girl, her soul a deep wave pearl, dim, lucent of all lovely mysteries, a face flowered for heart's ease, a brow's grace soft as seas, seen through faint forest trees, a mouth, the lips apart, like aspen leaflets trembling in the breeze from her tempestuous heart. Such, and our souls so knit, I leave the page half writ, the work begun, will be to heaven's conception done, if she come to it. I love this poem! Oh, I love this poem. Now, it was originally untitled. A Girl, the title, is taken from the very first line in the poem. Field adopts the 14-line poem sonnet, which was a traditionally masculine form of writing, and it is manipulated, and it blurs the lines and it bends the rules of sonnets enough until it just seemingly it falls apart. The way that they broke sonnet norms reflects the way that aestheticism pushed back against society's norms. They pushed the volta that traditionally occurs at line 8 of a sonnet instead to the end of the 9th line. Instead of a traditional sonnet rhyme scheme, they instead go for one which is AA, BBBB, CBC, volta, DDEED. The first line, which is simply a girl, breaks the sonnet convention entirely, with only 2 words and being only 2 syllables long. In doing this, Field sets the reader up for an unconventional poem. However, Field doesn't totally demolish the sonnet form. It does still have 14 lines and a rhyme scheme and a volta. They also focus on the beauty of an unnamed woman. This was a big thing in sonnets, specifically Petrarchan sonnets. They break this unnamed woman into different parts of her, so she's never seen as a full person, except for in that very first line, which is a girl. Even when they're talking about her soul, a deep wave pearl, is only given 2 lines of poetry. All of these different parts of her are being taken out to be admired by the reader before eventually moving on to the next thing entirely. The poem also doesn't shy away from the sonnet being very lustful. A quote to take that sort of emphasizes that is, mouth, the lips apart, like aspen leaflets trembling in the breeze. And yet, even though they're writing about a woman like a man would, there is a subversion because the authors were women, and that these women were writing about something in such a sexual way. The whole poem, in fact, views the subject as a sexual creature in a way that implies that the authors view writing the poem as a sexual act in itself. Michael Field managed to be both open and closed at the same time. They can hide their pleasure of being with each other as simply the pleasure that comes with writing something together. While their souls so knit, they come together to birth their mosaic work poetry. The last 4 lines of the poem carry a very, very strong sexual innuendo if you look for it, that can be read as just being about writing a poem together or about something else entirely. I'm gonna just re-say that now. See if you can flip it in your head. I leave a page half writ, the work begun, will be to heaven's conception done, if she come to it. The use of the word conception in a poem like this will usually bring a heterosexual relationship to the forefront of your mind, but this word, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, has contained a double meaning since 1605. Souls knitting together also contains a fairly sexual connotation, and it has contained that connotation for hundreds of years, way before Field uses it. If you think back to Othello, for example, and The Monster with Two Backs. Under their pseudonym, Bradley and Cooper were able to write a fairly openly sexual poem, and even after the discovery of their gender and who they were still able to hide the queerness in their poetry because of all of these double meanings that they used. In 1896, Field wrote another poem titled To Christina Rossetti, a then-deceased woman writer who was again very, very prolific. Lady, we would behold thee moving bright as Beatrice or Matilda mid the trees. Alas! Thy moan was as a moan for ease, and passage through cool shadows to the night. Fleeing from love, hadst thou not poet's right to slip into the universe? The seas are fathomless to rivers drowned in these, and sorrow is secure in leafy light. Ah, had this secret touched thee, in a tomb thou hadst not buried thy enchanting self, as happy Syrinx murmuring in the wind, or Daphne thrilled through all her mystic bloom, from safe recess as genius or as elf, thou hadst breathed joy in earth and in thy kind. Now, what on earth does that poem mean? I'm so glad you asked. The poem is urging the deceased writer to find joy for the sake of it being joyful. It is an aesthetic plea to this writer. In a letter that Michael Field wrote to Robert Browning, Bradley wrote, "We hold ourselves bound in life and literature to reveal, as far as may be, the beauty of the high feminine standard of the ought to be." That demonstrates their commitment to art and to the beautiful. Not only did Bradley and Cooper believe that they should live life in pursuit of beauty, they also believed that it was a poet's right to slip into the universe. And so therefore, their philosophy should also apply to other poets. Specifically in this poem, To Christina Rossetti. To Christina Rossetti is another sonnet. It is a Petrarchan sonnet, to be more specific. And this poem follows the rules of the form a lot more than A Girl does. Petrarchan sonnets tended to be the more masculine version of the sonnet, where the speaker usually is lamenting over a woman. Michael Field, however, isn't lamenting over an unnamed woman. Michael Field is lamenting over Christina Rossetti. The poem also follows a somewhat more regular rhyme scheme, being A, B, B, A, B, B, A, volta, C, D, E, C, D, E. Line 6 does break the form, with a question mark being in the middle of the line, splitting the line in half. Field brings to the forefront of the poem the wonder that exists in the world, and how blessed poets are to be able to be the ones to put it into words. The seas are fathomless to rivers drowned in these, and sorrow is secure in leafy light. The secret that they mention in their poem, while it is open to interpretation, reads to be the secrets of the world around Christina Rossetti. A world of love and life and beauty that she had missed out on due to her focus of illustrating melancholic deaths. The open adoration that Field has for the world around them does fall into the category of aestheticism. Now, moving on to Amy Levy, there is no evidence of Amy Levy ever entering into any relationship, much less a relationship with a woman. However, in a letter to her older sister, Levy writes of a grand passion for her headmistress and describes herself as being more in love with her than ever. So, draw from that what conclusions you will. Now, the poem of Amy Levy's that I would like to talk about isn't quite explicitly lesbian in nature. It's titled Ballad of an Omnibus, or Ballade of an Omnibus, but it does talk about the freedoms that a woman has because of the bus. Omnibus, which later got turned into the shortened version bus, which we now use, was essentially a bus. It was sort of a carriage that was being pulled by a horse, and it gave women freedom. Before omnibuses, women were pretty restricted to the private sphere, but with omnibuses they were able to meet with other women in public and go to department stores and cafes and things like that. So it was a feminist tool, essentially. Anyways, here is Ballad of an Omnibus. It starts with a quote. "To see my love suffices me. Some men to carriages aspire, on some the costly hansoms wait. Some seek a fly on job or hire, some mount the trotting steed elate. I envy not the rich and great, a wandering minstrel poor and free. I am contented with my fate. An omnibus suffices me. In winter days of rain and mire, I find within a corner straight the busmen know me and my lyre, from Brompton to the Bull and Gate. When summer comes, I mount in state the topmost summit, whence I see Croesus look up compassionate. An omnibus suffices me. I mark, untroubled by desire, Lucullus, Phaeton, and its freight, the scene whereof I cannot tire, the human tale of love and hate. The city pageant early and late unfolds itself, rolls by to be a pleasure deep and delicate. An omnibus suffices me. Princess, your splendor you require, I my simplicity agree, neither to rate lower nor higher. An omnibus suffices me. I love this poem. I love this poem. Now there's a lot of references in this poem to classical literature that I don't know all of, so whoops. Here's what I got from the poem, specifically relating to the topic at hand. So although it's not an openly queer poem, it finds aesthetic freedoms and beauty in everyday life. Like Field, Levy does adopt a more traditionally masculine style of poetry. Ballads were considered to be incredibly difficult to write. The ballad became extremely popular during the aesthetics movement, so it's only fair that she participate. The poem follows a pretty regular rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B, C in 3 of its stanzas. And in the final stanza, it is A, C, A, C. While the poem addresses itself to Princess through Amy Levy, the name of the woman who it's actually being said to is not explicitly stated, although clearly it is a woman in high esteem. The poem, written in 1889, discusses the newfound freedoms of women and finding a routine in their freedom. Specifically in London, Amy Levy lived in London. Levy implies that the speaker frequents the omnibus with the line, "The busmen know me and my lyre for Brompton to the Bull and Gate," so this is a pretty common occurrence for her, and that they seem to have the entirety of London within their grasp. The speaker describes the scene that they're seeing with the same reverence that one would give to a very impressive play. She even calls it the city pageant. By endowing the mundane with this expensive elegance, Levy is applying the ideal of aestheticism, which is searching for beauty in the world around her, even if it might appear queer to others. By applying the historical understanding of aestheticism and lesbianism to the works of Michael Field and Amy Levy, you're able to get a much deeper understanding of their works. While A Girl to Christina Rossetti, Ballad of an Omnibus, may be read as straight, that is to say written by a man or woman who didn't experience same-sex attraction or even participate in the aesthetics movement, by looking at it through those lenses, there's so much more to unpack and think about. By hiding in plain sight, as Martha Vicinus would put it, these women were able to write openly about their love of the world around them, and in Michael Field's case, write openly about the love they had for women, and more specifically for each other. Their separation from mainstream society at their time allowed them to write boldly in ways that hadn't been done before. Amy Levy and Michael Field's lesbianism and participation in the aesthetics movement is quintessential to their identities and to their work. Thank you all so much for sticking around for this very long-winded video about aestheticism and lesbianism. I sure had a great time, and I really hope that you're all maybe a little bit more excited to learn more about aestheticism and women's participation in literature and queer people's participation in literature. All of these really cool things to study. Subscribe if you want to see some more videos, or move on with your life. I don't mind. You can just go for it. Go and follow the footsteps of Amy Levy and Michael Field and enjoy the beautiful world around you. Have a great rest of your day, folks.